During a business trip, I stopped at a grocery store and saw a homeless woman holding a baby, begging for a can of formula. I froze. It was my daughter, but she should have been in New York. When she saw me, she burst into tears. "Dad, they dumped me here." My blood boiled. The rain had been coming down in that steady gray slush that hits the Midwest right before winter really sets in. My windshield wiper had started tearing on the drive up, so I pulled off the highway into the lot of a discount grocery outlet to grab a replacement blade. I'd been in town 3 days already, working through a logistics audit at the regional freight terminal, the kind of trip where you eat gas station sandwiches and fall asleep with the motel television still on. I remember the exact sound that stopped me. A voice, soft and raspy, cutting through the noise of the parking lot. "Please, sir, I don't need cash. Just a can of formula, that's all I need." I turned around out of nothing more than reflex, the way you do when a stranger addresses you in public. And what I saw stopped my heart in my chest so completely that for a second, I thought I'd misread the whole scene, that my mind was playing some cruel trick born of exhaustion and too much coffee. Sitting against the brick wall of the store, wrapped in a men's denim jacket 3 sizes too big for her, was a girl holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a faded yellow blanket. Her hair was matted down with rain. Her cheeks had gone hollow in a way I'd never seen on her before. Her lips had a blue tint to them that no 20-year-old's lips should ever have. It was my daughter. She was supposed to be 400 miles away, living in a bright apartment near a design school, building the kind of future I'd spent 26 years working overtime to help fund. Instead, she was sitting in the mud outside a grocery store in a city she had no business being in, begging strangers for baby formula. I dropped the bag I was carrying. It hit the wet pavement, and I didn't even look down. Hey, it's me." She flinched at the sound of my voice, pulling the blanket tighter around the baby like she was bracing for me to be angry, like there was some version of this moment where I could possibly be angry at her instead of everything else in the world. When she looked up and her eyes found mine, her whole face came apart. She didn't try to explain. She didn't try to run, and she didn't try to hide what she'd become in the 4 months since I'd last seen her smiling in the passenger seat of her own car, trunk packed with new clothes, waving at me through the rearview mirror as she pulled out of our driveway. She just cried, a deep, shuddering sob that seemed to pull up from somewhere below her ribs, the kind of crying that comes out only after a person has been holding something in for far longer than any person should have to. "Dad," she whispered. "Dad, please don't look at me like this." I went down onto my knees right there in the slush, not caring about my slacks, not caring about the people walking past us with their shopping carts, and I pulled her into my arms. Beneath that oversized jacket, I could feel every one of her collarbones. My daughter, who used to fill out a swim team uniform, who used to eat like a linebacker after track practice, had become something thin and breakable in the span of a single season. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice cracking on every word, looking down at the baby in her arms. The baby blinked up at the gray sky, a full head of dark hair already visible beneath the edge of the blanket, entirely unbothered by the rain or the cold or the fact that her mother was falling apart on a stranger's sidewalk. "She's 3 weeks old, Dad," my daughter said, and something in the way she said it, flat and rehearsed, like she'd practiced saying those words to herself in the mirror of some cracked bathroom for weeks, told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to explain herself to someone. "They dumped me here." I didn't ask another question in that parking lot. There would be time for questions. Right then, there was only the fact of my daughter shaking in my arms and a baby who needed to be somewhere warm, and I scooped up both of them and carried them to my truck like they weighed nothing at all, because in that moment, they didn't. I cranked the heat to maximum before I even had my seatbelt on, and I drove toward the nearest clinic I could remember passing on my way into town, my hands so tight on the wheel that my knuckles had gone white. In the passenger seat, my daughter held her baby against her chest and stared out the window at the gray city sliding past, and I understood even then, before I knew a single detail of what had actually happened to her, that whatever I learned in the next hour was going to change the rest of my life. The clinic was a squat brick building on a corner lot, the kind of urgent care that mostly treats sprained ankles and bad colds, but the woman at the front desk took one look at the state of my daughter and the baby and had us in a room within minutes. A nurse came in almost immediately, a woman somewhere in her 50s with kind eyes and the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen every version of a bad situation walk through that door. She wrapped the baby in a warm hospital blanket first, checking her over with gentle, practiced hands, murmuring reassurances the whole time in a voice pitched just for the baby. Then she brought my daughter a cup of hot broth and sat with her for a moment, checking her pulse, her temperature, the color under her fingernails, before finally stepping out to give us privacy while she pulled a doctor. That was when the story started coming out, not all at once, in pieces, the way a person tells something they've been carrying alone for so long that they've almost forgotten how to say it out loud. 5 months earlier, my daughter had found out she was pregnant. The father was a boy from her graphic design cohort at the community college near her apartment, someone she'd been seeing casually for a few months, and the moment he saw the positive test result, he stopped answering her calls entirely, blocked her number within a week, never spoke to her again. Terrified and alone in a city 400 miles from home, she had done the only thing that made sense to a scared 19-year-old. She reached out to family, but I was on the road. A 2-week freight dispatch audit down in Texas that had eaten up nearly all of that month. One of those trips where I was lucky to get a signal most evenings, let alone a real conversation. So instead of reaching me, she called the house and she got my wife. I need to explain something about my household before I go any further, because none of what happened next makes sense without understanding the architecture of the family I'd built, or thought I'd built, in the years after my first wife died. My daughter's mother passed away from lymphoma when she was 14. It was a slow decline, 18 months of hospital visits and medication schedules, and a house that got quieter with every passing month, and by the time it ended, the silence that settled into our home afterward was heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. I threw myself into work because work was the only thing that made sense anymore, and my daughter, who should have been allowed to just be a grieving 14-year-old, instead became the one holding our house together. She learned to cook her mother's recipes from memory. She kept the family calendar organized on the refrigerator with color-coded markers, doctor's appointments in blue, school events in green. When I came home late, exhausted down to my bones from managing an entire regional operation with half the staff we needed, I'd find a covered plate waiting on the counter with a note beside it in her handwriting. "Dad, eat first. Work can wait until morning." She was 15 years old writing me notes like that. I think about it more now than I ever did at the time. 3 years after her mother died, I met the woman who would become my second wife at a Chamber of Commerce mixer I'd only attended because a colleague dragged me there. She was loud in a way that felt at the time like exactly what our quiet house needed. Decisive, take charge. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. And after 3 years of a house that had gone silent, that kind of noise felt like a lifeline instead of a warning sign. I married her a year and a half later, and I told myself I was bringing structure back into our lives. Looking back, what I was actually doing was handing the keys of my household over to a woman who saw my daughter as nothing more than a financial obstacle standing between her own son and the life she believed he deserved. She had a son from her first marriage, 22 years old, who I will not dignify with more description than this. He didn't hold a job. He didn't attend school. He drove a restored classic car that I ended up quietly covering the repair bills for more times than I ever admitted to anyone, because keeping the peace in my own house had become, without my ever quite noticing it happen, the single organizing principle of my entire adult life. That was the household my daughter called when she found out she was pregnant and had nobody else to turn to. That was the woman who answered the phone instead of me. I think back now on the small moments that should have told me something was wrong long before that parking lot in the rain, and there were more of them than I want to admit. There was the year my wife decided, without asking me, that my daughter's old bedroom furniture needed replacing for guest use, and I came home to find her things boxed up in the garage before I'd even had a chance to say I wasn't ready for that yet. There was the way dinner conversations always seemed to circle back to whatever my stepson needed that month: a car repair, a new laptop for some class he never finished, and how I'd learned to just nod along and reach for my wallet rather than ask the harder question of why a grown man still needed his mother's husband covering his expenses. There was the Christmas, 2 years before all of this, when my daughter mentioned offhand that she felt like a guest in her own house now, and I told her that wasn't true, that she was imagining things, because agreeing with her would have meant admitting something about the marriage I'd built that I wasn't ready to look at directly. I see now that every one of those moments was a small test, and I failed every single one of them, not through cruelty, but through the specific cowardice of a man who had already lost one wife to something he couldn't control, and had decided, somewhere without ever consciously choosing it, that he would rather lose almost anything else than risk losing the appearance of a stable home a second time. My wife understood that about me better than I understood it about myself. She built her entire strategy around it. Every lie she told my daughter over those 4 months depended on one simple fact she'd learned early in our marriage: that I would rather believe an uncomfortable story than start a fight to find out if it was true. It is a strange kind of grief, realizing that your own patience was the exact tool someone used to hurt the person you loved most. I don't know that I've fully made peace with that part of it yet, even 6 months later. I don't know that I ever fully will. My wife did not call me. She did not text me. Instead, according to what my daughter told me in that clinic room, she sat her down at our kitchen table, the same table where my daughter had once done her homework every night after school, and told her that if I found out about the pregnancy, the stress could be enough to trigger another heart attack. I'd had a mild scare 2 years earlier. Chest pains that turned out to be stress and bad cholesterol rather than anything catastrophic. A week of tests and a change in diet and a prescription I'd been diligent about ever since. It had frightened all of us at the time, and my wife had apparently decided, in the moment my daughter needed her most, that this old scare was a tool she could use. She told my daughter I would be furious, that I was already struggling financially, which was not remotely true, and that her presence in the house, her existence as a source of stress and unpredictability, was actively destroying whatever peaceful retirement I had left to look forward to. She painted a picture of a father on the edge of collapse, a father who could not survive one more shock, and she painted my daughter as the shock waiting to happen. Then, having created that fear, she offered a way out of it. She said she had a sister who lived 400 miles away and ran a temporary housing program for young mothers. Quiet, discreet, exactly the kind of place a scared 19-year-old could disappear into while she figured out her next steps. She said she would personally handle the living expenses. She said she would make sure the college tuition fund, set up years earlier to cover her education, could be redirected to cover medical costs costs instead, since my daughter wouldn't exactly be needing tuition money if she wasn't planning to finish the semester anyway. She told my daughter to hand over her cell phone, said she'd buy her a new one with an unlisted number so the baby's father couldn't track her down and harass her, which on its face sounded like the kind of protective instinct a parent should have. What it actually did was cut her off from every single person in her life who might have told her the truth. She handed her a $75 prepaid burner phone instead and put her on a bus. There was no sister. There was no temporary housing program. When my daughter arrived at the address she'd been given, expecting some kind of shelter with staff and structure and other young women in her situation, what she found instead was a rundown rooming house on the edge of a neighborhood she didn't recognize, owned by a man who turned out to be a friend of my stepson's from some previous, murkier chapter of his life. The room had a lock on the door that didn't fully catch. The building smelled like mildew and old cigarette smoke. There was no staff. There was no program. There was just a landlord who wanted rent money on the first of every month, and a girl 5 months pregnant with nowhere else to go and no way to get back home without confirming everything she'd been told about a father who supposedly no longer wanted her. For 4 months, my daughter lived in that room. She rationed what little cash she'd brought with her. She learned which convenience stores nearby would let her use the bathroom without buying anything, and every single time she called the burner phone number she'd been given, asking to speak to me, asking if I knew where she was, asking if I was really as angry as she'd been told, she was told the same thing, that I was still furious, that I refused to speak to her, that if she tried to come home, I would have the police remove her from the property for trespassing, because that was apparently how far my wife was willing to take the lie, painting me as a man who would call the police on his own pregnant daughter rather than let her back through the front door. I want to be clear about something. In 26 years of raising this girl, I had never once raised my voice at her over anything that mattered. I had never made her feel like a burden. And somewhere out there for 4 months, my daughter believed with her whole heart that I hated her, that I had abandoned her, that the man who used to sit with her every night after her mother died, the two of us eating dinner in silence just so neither of us had to be alone with it, had turned his back on her the moment she needed him the most. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't the room, or the hunger, or the fear of giving birth alone in an unfamiliar city. The hardest part was believing, every single day for 4 months, that I had chosen this for her, that I had chosen my wife's comfort and her son's over my own daughter's safety. The room my daughter lived in for those 4 months had a single window that didn't open more than a few inches, painted shut sometime in a previous decade. She kept her few belongings in the same 2 bags she'd packed the day she was put on the bus, because unpacking felt like admitting this was where she actually lived now, instead of some temporary detour on her way back home. She found a part-time stocking job at a dollar store 2 blocks away, one that didn't ask too many questions about her situation, as long as she could still lift boxes, and she worked right up until she physically couldn't anymore. She ate mostly from the discount shelf near the back of that same store, the dented cans and the bread that expired the next day, because every dollar she didn't spend was a dollar she might need for the baby. She told me she used to sit by that painted shut window some nights and try to picture our kitchen back home, the specific angle of light through the curtains in the late afternoon, the sound the screen door made when it needed oiling, a sound I'd meant to fix for 2 years and never got around to. She said those small, stupid details were the only thing that kept her from completely unraveling some nights, the certainty that somewhere those details still existed even if she couldn't reach them anymore. She called the burner phone number every week or two, and every time she got the same script. I was still too angry to speak to her. I'd said something new and worse each time, each fabricated line designed to make the wall between us look higher than the last time. She stopped calling as often after a while, not because she stopped hoping, but because hearing it confirmed again and again had become its own kind of wound she couldn't keep opening. There was one habit she told me about later that I still think about more than almost anything else from those 4 months. Every night before she fell asleep, she would run through a short list in her head, the same list, in the same order, like a kind of prayer she didn't quite believe in anymore but couldn't stop reciting anyway. The smell of the coffee I used to make on weekend mornings, the particular creak of the 3rd stair from the top, the sound of my truck pulling into the driveway around 6 most evenings, an engine she said she could pick out of 100 others even now. She told me she used that list to fall asleep some nights, not because it comforted her exactly, but because it was proof, at least to herself, that a different life had once been real and hadn't just been something she'd imagined. She never once, in 4 months of believing I hated her, stopped running through that list. Back in the clinic room, while the doctor examined the baby and the nurse checked my daughter's blood pressure for the 2nd time, my daughter said something almost in passing, the way people mention details that seem small to them but land like a struck bell to whoever's actually listening. At least I still have my tuition money, she said, more to herself than to me, absently rubbing the baby's back. She said she moved it to cover the medical stuff, but there should still be some left for when I go back. I remember going very still when she said that, because I had set up that trust myself years earlier in the name of my daughter's late mother, specifically earmarked for her college education and nothing else. It required my signature to touch, not my wife's, not anyone's but mine, drawn up that way on purpose because I'd wanted it protected from exactly the kind of situation I now found myself sitting in the middle of. I hadn't signed anything. I didn't say this out loud to her in that moment. She was exhausted, still shaking, still working through the shock of being found after 4 months of believing she'd never be found at all. And this wasn't the time to load another fear onto her. But something cold settled into my stomach right then, a suspicion I couldn't yet prove and didn't want to, because proving it meant confirming that the woman I'd married hadn't just lied about my feelings toward my own daughter. She'd been moving money that legally required my authorization to move. I told myself there could be an explanation, a misunderstanding, some administrative transfer I'd forgotten signing in the blur of a busy year. I did not yet know how wrong that hope would turn out to be, or how much worse the truth was than the version of it I was still, in that clinic room, trying to talk myself out of believing. 2 weeks after the baby was born, the same landlord who owned the rooming house told her the room was needed for someone else, and she had until the end of the week to clear out. She didn't have anywhere to go. She didn't have enough saved for a deposit anywhere new, not with a newborn and a body still recovering from labor, and a job she'd had to quit the week before delivery. That was when my stepson showed up. She said she'd only met him a handful of times before that day, mostly in passing at family dinners back when things still felt normal, and she remembered being surprised he even knew where she was living. He told her he was there to help, said he had a friend who could get her somewhere better, somewhere with actual support for young mothers, and that he'd drive her there himself. He loaded her 2 bags and the baby's few things into the back of his car. They drove for what felt like a long time, longer than she expected, out past neighborhoods she recognized and into ones she didn't. When the car finally stopped, they were in the parking lot of a discount grocery outlet on the edge of a part of the city she'd never been to before. He told her to wait there, said his friend would be along shortly to pick her up and take her to the new place. Then he handed her $20, got back in his car, and drove away. Nobody came. She sat in that lot for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, holding a baby that wouldn't stop crying from the cold, before she finally understood that no one was coming, that there had never been a friend, that she had simply been driven somewhere far enough from anywhere she knew and left there, the way you might abandon something you no longer wanted but didn't want the mess of disposing of yourself. She'd been sitting outside that same store on and off for 2 days by the time I found her, sleeping in a stairwell around the back at night, asking anyone who passed for something, anything, that might keep her daughter fed because her own hunger had stopped mattering to her somewhere around the first night. She told me, "You hated me, Dad," my daughter said, back in the present, sitting on the exam table with her daughter finally asleep against her chest. Her voice had gone very quiet, the exhaustion of finally saying all of it out loud settling over her like a weight. She said, "You told her you never wanted to see my face again." I sat in the plastic chair beside the exam table and held both of her hands in mine, and I felt something shift in the base of my spine that had nothing to do with sadness. Sadness would come later, in waves, at unexpected moments over the following weeks. What I felt right then was colder and steadier than that, a kind of clarity. For 3 years, I had told myself that keeping the peace in my own household was a virtue, that avoiding conflict with my wife, letting her decisions stand unchallenged because challenging them meant another fight I didn't have the energy for, was simply the price of a calm home after years of grief. I understood now, sitting in that plastic chair, that my desire to avoid conflict had not protected my family. It had left a door wide open for someone to walk through and do exactly what she wanted with the people inside it, because she knew I would rather absorb the damage quietly than confront her directly. I called my district manager from the clinic hallway and told him I needed emergency leave, effective immediately. He didn't ask questions beyond whether everyone was safe, and I told him as safe as we could manage for now. Then I called an old friend from high school who'd built a small but sharp family law practice back home over the following 3 decades. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years, not since a chance run-in at a hardware store, but he picked up on the second ring and didn't hesitate when I told him I needed to see him as soon as I could get back into town. I signed my daughter and the baby out of the clinic that evening with a clean bill of health, a follow-up appointment scheduled for later in the week, and a prescription for the kind of basic nutritional supplements a body needs after 4 months of not getting nearly enough of anything. I found us a short-term rental near the clinic that night, paid for a week up front in cash, and made sure the refrigerator was full before I let myself sleep. 2 days later, I brought my daughter and the paperwork I could gather into my attorney's office, and I watched my daughter tell the entire story again, start to finish, to a man taking notes on a yellow legal pad with an expression that grew more still with every sentence she spoke. When my daughter finished speaking, my attorney set his pen down on the legal pad, took off his reading glasses, and looked at me for a long moment before he said anything at all. "We have her," he said, "but I need 48 hours with your bank records before I tell you exactly how badly." Those 48 hours were some of the longest of my life. He pulled records from the trust account, cross-referenced signature cards, requested transaction histories going back the full 4 months since my daughter had disappeared. I sat in his office on the second afternoon while he laid it all out across his desk, and I understood, watching his face, that whatever he was about to tell me was worse than the version I'd been quietly bracing for since that moment in the clinic room when she'd mentioned her tuition money in passing. My wife had made one catastrophic error in all of this, the kind of error people only make when greed convinces them they'll never actually get caught. She had forged my signature on 6 separate withdrawal forms over 4 months, moving money out of the educational trust I'd established for my daughter in her late mother's name. The total total came to $41,000. None of it had gone toward her tuition. None of it had gone toward her medical care, despite every promise that had been made about covering those costs. $34,000 had been wired directly into a limited liability company registered in my stepson's name, tied to a high-risk cryptocurrency investment scheme that had collapsed completely 3 weeks before I found my daughter outside that grocery store, wiping out every dollar that had gone into it. The remaining $7,000 had gone to new furniture for our living room and a down payment on a boat trailer my stepson had been talking about buying for most of the summer. My wife had stripped my daughter of the one piece of financial security her late mother had left specifically for her, lied about her existence to everyone who might have asked, and let her freeze on a sidewalk with a newborn. Also, her son could gamble away a dead woman's final gift to her own child on an investment that failed before my daughter even had the chance to learn what had happened to it. My attorney showed me the wire transfer records themselves, printed and highlighted across 3 separate pages, and there was something almost clinical about seeing it laid out that way. Dates and dollar amounts in neat columns that made the whole thing feel somehow more real than the version of it I'd been carrying around in my head for 2 days. 6 forged signatures. 6 dates I could now match against 6 evenings. I remembered sitting at that same dinner table, having no idea what had happened earlier that same day. One withdrawal had gone through on a Tuesday afternoon, in what would have been her 7th month, while I sat in this same city eating a sandwich at my desk between meetings, entirely unaware that 400 miles away, my daughter was 3 days from giving birth alone in a room with a lock that didn't catch. I wanted to drive straight home that afternoon and throw every one of my wife's belongings out onto the front lawn. My attorney stopped me before I even finished saying it out loud. "If you do that today," he said, "she files for divorce by the end of the week. She claims spousal support. She fights you for half your pension and half the house in a proceeding that could take a year or more, and there's a real chance a judge splits assets before any of this fraud ever makes it in front of a prosecutor. We don't want a messy fight where she gets to play the wronged wife. We want something clean, something she can't walk away from with anything at all." He laid out the plan carefully over the rest of that meeting. I would go home and act like nothing had changed. I would let my wife keep talking about whatever she wanted to talk about, curtains, my stepson's next idea, anything at all, and I would document every word of it. We would build the case in silence for a few days, and then we would end it in a single evening, with no warning and no room for her to maneuver. My attorney was specific about the sequence. He wanted the forged signatures matched against dated bank records before I said a single word to my wife, wanted my daughter's signed affidavit notarized and sitting in his office safe, wanted the quitclaim paperwork drafted and ready to place on a table before I ever confronted anyone with what I knew. "The worst thing you can do," he told me, "is show your hand before the trap is actually built. People like this don't panic and confess. They panic and they run, or they panic and they lawyer up before you've got anything you can use." I didn't like the idea of sitting across a dinner table from her, pretending everything was fine, knowing what I now knew, but I trusted him, and more than that, I understood that my daughter and granddaughter needed me thinking clearly right now, more than they needed me satisfying the urge to blow everything up in a single afternoon. So that evening, I drove home. My wife was sitting on the sofa with a glass of white wine when I walked through the front door that evening, some home renovation show playing on the television, not even turning her head to look at me. "How was Toledo, honey?" she asked. "Did the audit go okay?" "It went fine," I said, setting my briefcase down by the coat rack, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "Lots of discrepancies in the paperwork. Takes time to sort out who belongs where." "Well, you work too hard," she said, still watching the television. "Oh, by the way, my son's coming over for dinner Sunday. He wants to talk through a new business opportunity. Might need a small loan to get it started, but I told him his stepdad would be happy to hear him out." "Is that so?" I said. "Sunday sounds fine. Let's make it a big dinner." For the next 2 days, I lived something close to 2 separate lives. During the day, I drove to the rental apartment where my daughter and the baby were staying, brought groceries, brought a crib I'd ordered, and assembled myself in an hour that felt like the first genuinely peaceful hour I'd had in longer than I could remember. I sat by the window some afternoons just watching my granddaughter sleep, feeling something steady return to my chest that had been missing since long before I even understood it was gone. At night, I came home and sat across the dinner table from her, and I listened to her talk about new curtains for the guest room, about how well my stepson was finally finding his footing, about nothing at all that mattered, and every single time she spoke, I noted the date and the substance of it in a small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket the moment I was alone again. I didn't raise my voice once in those 2 days. I didn't let a single flicker of what I now knew show on my face. It was, without question, the hardest acting I have ever done in my life. Sitting across from a woman I now understood had orchestrated 4 months of my daughter's suffering and passing her the salt when she asked for it. Sunday evening, the dining room table was set with the good dishes, a roast chicken at the center that my wife had spent most of the afternoon preparing. My stepson arrived at 4:45 wearing a brand new leather jacket, the kind of jacket bought with money he had no legitimate way of earning, and settled into his usual seat like he owned the place. He waited until we were most of the way through the meal before he made his pitch, buttering a roll like the whole thing was casual, like he hadn't clearly clearly rehearsed this in the car on the way over. So, he said, leaning back in his chair, the crypto thing had a rough patch, but this new logistics venture I've been looking at, it's basically a guaranteed win. I just need about 15 grand to secure the regional rights. Mom said you might be able to pull it from my sister's college fund since she's, well, clearly not using it right now. My wife took a slow sip of her wine, nodding along like this was the most reasonable request in the world. It really is a smart move, she said. She made her choice to walk away from this family. There's no reason to let that money just sit there gathering dust when he can actually build something with it. I laid my fork down on my plate. The sound of metal against porcelain was the only noise in the room for a moment. You're right, I said, keeping my voice even. Capital shouldn't just sit there doing nothing. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folders I'd been carrying since that morning, and I set them down on the table between the bread basket and the roast. What's that? She asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at the folders. That's the accounting summary from the bank, I said, along with certified copies of the withdrawal signatures for $41,000, pulled from my daughter's educational trust over the last 4 months. Her hand froze around the stem of her wine glass. My stepson stopped chewing entirely, the roll still half raised toward his mouth. What are you talking about? She said, her voice dropping into that stern, dismissive register she always used whenever money came up. We discussed those administrative transfers. I didn't sign them, I said quietly. My signature was forged 6 separate times. Now wait a minute, my stepson started, leaning forward. Sit down, I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was flat, and it was completely without room for negotiation, and something in it made him actually stop mid-sentence and sit back in his chair. I spent Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store parking lot, I continued, looking directly at her now. I found my daughter sitting in the freezing rain begging strangers for baby formula because her clothes didn't fit anymore and she hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. The color drained entirely out of her face. Her lips parted, but for a long moment, nothing came out of them at all. You told her I hated her, I said. You told her I'd disown her. You put a frightened 19-year-old on a bus, dumped her in a room with a broken lock 400 miles from home, and let your son drop her on a sidewalk like trash so the two of you could gamble her mother's legacy away on a currency that doesn't even exist anymore. Listen to me, she stammered, reaching across the table toward my arm, her composure finally cracking open completely. I was trying to protect you. Your heart, you couldn't handle the stress. I was only, do not touch me, I said, and something in my tone made her hand stop in midair and retreat back to her own side of the table. I opened the first folder and laid the top page flat where both of them could see it. Option 1, I said, a formal criminal complaint for bank fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny, along with a signed affidavit from my daughter detailing the coercion and the abandonment. My attorney is standing by right now. If I call him in the next 5 minutes, these are filed with the county prosecutor by 8 tomorrow morning. Grand larceny carries a mandatory minimum sentence in this state. Both of your names are on those withdrawal forms. Both of you go down together. My stepson's jaw actually dropped open. Mom, what is he talking about? You said he wouldn't check. Her hands had started shaking badly enough that her wine glass trembled where it sat. Please, you wouldn't do that to us. We're family. We are not family, I said, and I slid the second folder across the table to sit directly in front of her. Option 2 is right here. A legally binding confession of judgment and a quitclaim deed. You sign over your entire interest in the house to me immediately and relinquish any claim to my retirement accounts, my savings, or spousal support of any kind. Your son signs a promissory note binding him to repay the full $41,000 to my daughter's trust, structured at $800 a month, secured against his car and whatever else he owns. That's extortion, my stepson said, slamming his palm flat against the table. That's leniency, I corrected him. You have 4 minutes to decide whether you'd rather sign those papers or explain to a judge why you left a teenage girl and a newborn on a sidewalk in the rain. The room went silent except for the clock ticking in the hallway, each second landing like a small hammer blow. My stepson's phone lit up with missed calls neither of them glanced at. She looked at her son. He looked down at the table. Both understood that if police pulled the thread on that collapsed scheme, everything else about their lives would unravel within days. With trembling fingers, she picked up the pen and signed every line without looking at me, then slid it to her son without a word. He pressed down so hard his signature bled through the page beneath it. You have 2 hours to pack your things and be out of this house, I told them, gathering the signed documents back into my briefcase. If either of you ever comes near my daughter, my granddaughter, or me again, option 1 goes straight to the prosecutor regardless of anything else that's happened between now and then. I didn't stay to watch them pack. I drove to the rental apartment and brought my daughter and the baby home instead. The house sat dark and empty when we pulled in, every trace of her gone. It felt clean for the first time in 3 years. It has been 6 months since that dinner. The deed was recorded within the week. My stepson has made his payments on time. His mother took a night shift job to help cover it. I haven't spoken to either of them since. My daughter enrolled at the state university 10 minutes from home instead of going back upstate, close enough that I watch my granddaughter grow up instead of hearing about it over a phone call twice a month. Every morning I make coffee before her alarm goes off and hold my granddaughter while she gets ready for class, and some mornings she falls asleep against my chest before I set her down. Last night I sat on the back porch after everyone had gone to bed, listening to the wind move through the oak trees. When my daughter came out carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She sat down beside me and handed me one, and for a while neither of us said anything. "Dad," she finally said, looking out over the dark yard instead of at me. "Thank you for coming to find me." I looked over at my daughter, her face full of color again, her eyes clear and steady in a way they hadn't been in that clinic room 6 months earlier, and I took a slow sip of the tea before I answered her. "I was always coming," I told her. "I just took the long way around to get there."